chance to ask questions.
Maybe I'll start with one quick question, Louise. Given that PLOS One is sort of key in terms of the last couple of years in terms of number of articles and the controversial rise of the APC costs, does that feel like is something happening in the marketplace, or do you feel like that's more of an indication that your business at PLOS is stabilizing from a period of really rapid growth?
Can everyone hear me? So we attribute that in large part to the rise of the competitors. There are some really, really good competitive journals out there in the mega journal space, if you will. And so that has certainly led to an overall rise in the amount of content published in the mega journals. But so, we've lost a few in the process too.
Sort of for both of you, Stephen, you had a slide that looked at the list price and then some variations on the list price, and then Louise, you touched very briefly on something like that. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of what types of variations on list price we're seeing and how that's actually filtering through the market?
So I can talk not so much about list price, but about what people are actually paying. Okay. And there is a difference between them. And one of the reasons we wanted to investigate it from that end, as it were, is what people were actually paying, is because we were conscious that there were differences between list prices and actual payments being made, and we wanted to see what that meant. So it showed the same trends as the analyses of list prices, but not exactly the same prices, because we, for instance, counted a zero APC payment as a zero payment, where there was, say, for instance, the Royal Society of Chemistry gold for gold model, where you get a zeroized APC. We counted that as a zero payment. We saw enormous variation in prices actually being paid. It was very clear, though, that the fully open access publishers publishing fully open access journals were, on average, considerably cheaper than hybrid journals, which were top, and then in between the two, the fully open access journals published by conventional publishers. And it really is quite marked difference. It's not a trivial difference, it's quite marked. So that's what we saw. But in terms of variation, it was enormous, from zero through to, $6,000. Not just for mega journals, but for APCs in general.
I have a question to you, Louise. I like your comparison between the classical peer review process, doing this and the time scale of 6 to 18 months compared to the preprint peer review process. So here's my question. In medical sciences, I have heard often you do double-blind peer review, so the authors don't know, of course, who the reviewers are, but the reviewers don't know who the authors are.
Right.
So how would that work in that print process, and could there be a risk that there's a bias being introduced because the community sees who's the author, where they come from?
So in the preprint model, there are no reviews. So there isn't actually any kind of peer review at all. In order for something to get online within 24 hours, as bioRxiv does, there is no peer review. There is a check to make sure that it isn't, this is what we're thinking, is that there isn't going to be a release of, location of endangered species and pictures of children and stuff like that. So there has to be some modicum of check that needs to be done, but that would not be public. It would not be a peer review process in order for it to be done so quickly. The idea is then that content and would then go through a process of going through a publication journal and get published in a journal where there would be selection and there would be peer review, but that preprint would exist first. And so they would need to coexist. And some of these dials still need to get turned. This is not widely adopted yet. The funders have not, stated clearly, not all of them at least, have stated clearly that they will allow preprints, or that institutions that give tenure would allow preprints. Until those things really change, authors aren't going to be motivated to do this, even if it means that their content will be up in 24 hours, because they're still concerned about primacy, they're still concerned about quality, and they're worried that they would not ever be considered for a selective journal.
Just to say that there are already working models of how this happens. I mean, high-energy physicists have been doing this for 25 years. Not run by a publisher, but the archive preprint server does exactly that. It makes available stuff as soon as it's produced, and in some cases in physics journals, you can submit to that journal by giving them a link to your archive preprint. Mm-hmm. Communities different, academic disciplines different, but this is a working model that's been successful for 25 years. One of the interesting points I just wanted to make about disciplines as well is that, and this might relate to what Louise said about competition, our analysis of mega journals shows that PLOS One, even though it accepts material from across different disciplines, is predominantly publishing stuff in the life sciences. And interestingly, Scientific Reports, the Nature mega journal, is predominantly publishing stuff in the physical sciences. So there seems to be a direction where authors are going, even though the scope is very wide. There seems to be a preference for PLOS titles, I guess coming down from medicine and biology in the early days. It's recognized by life scientists, and Nature is more, the mega journal is more favored by physical scientists. And it'd be interesting to see where that continues, but it's certainly clearly the case at the moment.
Just as a follow-up, as far as the preprint approach goes, aren't there copyright issues involved too in that? Could there be cases where a preprint is published online, wherever they submit it to, as a journal, maybe they don't accept it for final publication. But doesn't that limit then the author? Because if it applies to another journal, it's already been out there, so why should they?
So, do you want to answer that?
Well, there's just a big debate about this. There has been for the last 20 years. People, you may have been involved in this, but there were when Archive first. I mean, Archive was set up as a result of an established preprint tradition in the physics community that involved originally people, running off copies of their papers and putting them in the mail to distribute them. And then it was automated, and then they said, oh, right, we can do this better, and so on. People started putting up postprints as well after they'd been accepted by journals in archives. So the whole thing is a rather different beast from what it was originally designed to be. But this question, many physics publishers, I'd be interested to know if there are any in the room, have had to kind of accept that this is the way the disciplinary community wants to operate, and have therefore amended their rules of engagement accordingly.
Well, I think that there's probably precedent, so I don't know if, John, you want to say something about bioRxiv?
So I'm John Ingles. I'm one of the two co-founders of bioRxiv. So to the points that you made earlier, there is no difficulty. I mean, what we had re-elected to do at the beginning of bioRxiv was give authors the maximum choice of license that they could attach to their preprint, knowing that when that preprint was finally published, as nearly 60% of what's on bioRxiv has been published in journals, often very selective journals too, the license attached to that manuscript can change according to the author's wishes or the desire of the journal. And from a legal perspective, there is no difficulty with that. In these early days of preprints in biomedicine, not surprisingly, authors are taking conservative choices. For example, only 20% of them have chosen a CC BY license at that level. And if you look at some of those choices, it's clear that a thoughtful process has gone into that. An author has produced a tool, a software, or whatever that they want to be freely available without any restriction. But in the case of experimental data and experimental results, then the attitude is rather different. So we are in early days. The reason I differ about the rate of uptake of preprints, bioarchive is only 2.5 years old, and with each month that goes by, we get more and more submissions. So and journals are increasingly permissive of posting preprints before they will consider a manuscript. So I mean, it is a slow process, as indeed archive was a slow process. It started in one small corner of physics, and only slowly grew to embrace other parts of physics, and then eventually economics and computer science and quantitative biology. So I think we are seeing fairly rapid shifts in attitude within biology towards preprints. But having talked too much already, can I make a statement perhaps and get the two of you to comment? So PLOS One had first mover advantage when it came to a large mega journal with an open access approach. And despite Louise's statement about the material that was put on PLOS One not being end stage, I don't want to use the term dumping ground, but I think the genius of PLOS One was to give a scientific group the opportunity to publish something that had reached a certain stage beyond which it would not go, either intellectually, materially, in personnel terms, or whatever. And my view, from talking to lots of scientists, is that PLOS One offered a wonderful channel for that opportunity, and now it is much more complicated than that. But it got established because it identified a need that was not being met by the existing journal system. The nature of open access journals, of course, work on the basis simply of their brand, and part of the enthusiasm for the nature of open access journals in China is because of that very strong association between the need to publish in a highly valued branded journal, and there are incentives in the Chinese system for that. So, very long preamble, but my question is, do you think that actually there will never be more successful mega journals because the brand piece has been occupied, that space has been occupied by nature, and first mover advantage was occupied by PLOS One. So lots of people are trying to do mega journals in biomedicine. Will they be as successful as those two?
I think it's a really interesting question, and that's partly one of the major questions that was driving our research project. What is it that is motivating publishers to set up mega journals, and will they be successful? I think because there's been a rush over the last 3 or 4 years for pretty much all publishers, with a few exceptions actually, but pretty much all publishers to set up a mega journal, but where the brand doesn't have that clear association. So the reputational subsidy argument doesn't seem to apply, and it's those journals which don't seem to be growing as quickly, which I think is interesting, but it remains to be seen whether they do. The nature of the mega journal, though, is that you'd expect a few very large titles, wouldn't you? I mean, the point is not to have lots of them. So you would only expect some to be the dominant titles, in theory at least. But I think it remains to be seen. I think it's interesting whether it will have significant disciplinary differences in terms of the reception. In the humanities and social sciences, I think it's an interesting open question at the moment about whether mega journals fit. So I think it's all to play for, and I think that's one of the interesting things about it. But the changing models of publishing that it is maybe giving rise to, moving beyond the mega journal to these other more fluid notions of what is a publication, I think is also really interesting, and it may have taken the phenomenon of the mega journal to enable those steps to be had in some disciplines.
I think you make a really good point, because what we're finding certainly with the size and scale of one is, how do you create community? How do you create awareness? and discoverability for this level of content. And as, you know, if the purpose of all of us being here is to make sure that all of this science gets published and that it actually is available, then the package in what that is in terms of either a journal or a collection or what have you is going to change. And I think that one of the things that may change is the adherence to the value of the citation. Because if you remove yourself from the value of that citation and you say, okay, the citation can be +1. And then when it comes out, I'm going to create a collection. And those articles, those, you know, that piece of it is something that I'm going to be a part of. Or that my editors, my members, my, you know, my reviewers will be a part of the +1 cycle so that it can get through because of expertise, because of scope, because of, you know, timeliness. But then at the end of the day, the publication that I have, it's not a journal, but it's a collection. It's a landing page. It's a way for people to get to that content. So there is going to be a shift, we think, because when we look at all of publishing, when we all talk to each other, we tend to think at a layer that is pretty high level. And there is an enormous amount of content and research and work that is done that doesn't reach that level. And how do you get that out? And there are different ways that you can communicate with those groups and make sure that content is published in a way that is meaningful. And so those are also different things that we are playing with on the edges at PLOS because, again, what the researcher needs is what we're trying to deliver.
There's a question there.
In short, just briefly, perhaps in a different direction, you mentioned that Herta was going to be open source.
Yes.
Did you say? Is that in a simple sense of a legal requirement, or is that a bigger kind of move towards collaboration?
It's a collaboration, so it's going to be an MIT license. And so we're right now, it's still an MVP, and so we're moving it forward, but we're doing some co-development on it with other publishers as well, so that we can expand the code faster and get it into a state that can work well for lots of publishers in lots of different ways. But yeah, that's coming probably next year.
Yeah, you both mentioned that the editorial criteria for +1 is based solely on soundness of the results as opposed to interest or substantive scope. And I guess I'm curious, have there been challenges in getting editors or peer reviewers to refrain from going further than that? Like, I'm really curious how those discussions have happened, because I mean, everybody says more than they need to, always. And I'm trying to figure out how one reins people in.
So we actually have less of a problem with reining people in. It's getting people to pick up the article. And so in some cases, we've had comments like, this is boring. I'm not going to do this. And so it's actually more about finding people with the right match. So with that kind of a pool of reviewers out there, finding somebody who actually can look at it with the right critical eye, you know, again, around soundness, not again around subject matter, but they still need to know the subject matter. We can't have, you know, an economics person looking at a medical paper. So there is a certain amount of match that is a real challenge. And that is definitely something that we struggle with because we want to do that better, we want to do it faster, and we want to do it with better results for the author. And so in some areas, you know, as Steve was saying, in life sciences and in medicine, we're pretty good. You know, we've got that landscape covered. But you start flirting with the edges, and it takes a while for us to find those papers, find matches for those papers. So once we get them, it tends to be pretty quick. The thing that we do struggle with as well is the number of revisions that are requested. Sometimes the reviewers will still be in a realm of selective, that it needs lots of revisions, and going back to the author many times always takes a lot of time, that sort of round trip. So we are working on what are the criteria around what is a revision, what is a minor revision, a major revision, how many times does it really need to go back out to the author before it's really ready for publication. And so that's also a bar that we have to flirt with as well. Some things are obvious, but usually it's the 80-20 rule. We spend a lot of our time on that 20%.
I think you raise a really interesting question. It's exactly the question I was referring to about the cultural shift. And in the role of the gatekeeper. This is a diminished role for the gatekeeper in just determining scientific soundness. And the question is, how kindly will many academics take to that diminished role? The studies that have been done of why people do peer reviewing, apart from the fact it's a kind of a sense of duty, some of the factors are, contributing to a discipline, contributing to its shape, being, wanting to be involved in that decision about what's important and what's novel, what's of interest. If you take those things away, it's a different job and it's a diminished job. And it's an interesting question about whether people want to do that. And it's also an interesting question about whether their behavior actually changes. I mean, who reads the guide for peer reviewers when they do a peer review? No, I don't know of a study on that, but anecdotally, virtually nobody. And it's really interesting. I published in PLOS ONE, and the article came back, the reviews came back saying things like novel, important, interest, those same criteria are being applied. Now, how the editor then used those is an interesting question. But that's one of the questions we're asking the publishers we're talking to about in our research project at the moment. Does the behaviour of peer reviewers actually change? Or is there something going on here which you have to then filter out in terms of whether you accept a journal article or not? I think it's a really interesting question.
What concerns does PLOS have about liability, particularly for the non-peer reviewed preprints, and are there mechanisms in place to protect yourself?
It's a really good question. We haven't launched preprints yet. We support preprints. We certainly direct our authors to post their preprints in bioRxiv and other preprint servers. And so we're still looking into all of those aspects. But, as Stephen and John have said, there have been successes in the physical world as well as in the biological sciences already. And so the liability is on the low side because we're not actually standing by it, saying that it's sound. We're making it available. But I do think it is a very interesting line that we have to be careful about crossing, which is why the amount of ethical and technical check you put in, you either say you're doing nothing and you walk away and you stand back and you say, whatever happens, happens, or you say, I have checked this for XYZ, and if something does sneak through, am I on the line now? And so that's kind of where what we're talking about right now, because when we look at what we do for PLOS ONE and we say, okay, let's just do that. Let's just do that. That's not going to scale at the level of where biomedical preprints could go. Let's say biomedical preprints go into the 500,000, 1 million range. That's not something that even PLOS could do at the scale that we're at right now. So we have to find new ways of doing that and making sure that that line is clear. But it's a good question.